The air at Myall Creek today is often still. Sunlight filters through the leaves of the eucalypts, dappling the ground. You might hear the call of a bird, the rustle of wind in the long grass. It feels like a place of peace, a sanctuary almost. The earth here is ancient, holding stories that stretch back countless generations. Visitors come. They walk softly, they listen. There is a sense of quiet contemplation, a feeling that this land demands respect, a gentle tread. Yet this tranquility is a thin veil over a profound wound. This very ground, now so serene, once bore witness to an act of unimaginable brutality. The peace you feel is a modern construct, a hard-won quiet that has taken generations to even begin to settle. Beneath the gum trees, beside the creek that gives this place its name, a terrible crime occurred. The site today, with its memorial, serves as a solemn testament to the victims, a place where their story is told, where their humanity is affirmed. The 1830s in colonial Australia were a time of relentless expansion. The British Crown had claimed a continent, and settlers, hungry for land, pushed ever further into territories that had been home to Aboriginal peoples for millennia. This was the frontier, a moving line of contact and, all too often, a line of conflict. The official narrative was one of progress, of taming a wild land, of building a new society. But this narrative deliberately overlooked the existing societies, the ancient cultures, and the deep spiritual connection Aboriginal people had with their ancestral lands. Tensions were an inevitable consequence of this relentless encroachment. Settlers, often isolated and fearful, saw Aboriginal people as a threat to their newly acquired holdings and their livestock. Aboriginal people, in turn, saw their traditional hunting grounds destroyed, their sacred sites desecrated, and their way of life irrevocably altered. Resistance was met with force, and a cycle of violence began to escalate across many parts of the colony. This was the backdrop against which the Myall Creek Massacre occurred. The victims of the Myall Creek Massacre were primarily from the Wiradjuri group of the Gamilaraay Nation. These were people with a profound and ancient connection to the lands around the Gwydir River and Myall Creek. Their lives were intricately woven into the rhythms of the seasons, the movements of animals, and the spiritual significance of the landscape. They were not nomadic wanderers, as some colonial narratives suggested, but people who managed their country with sophisticated knowledge accumulated over tens of thousands of years. The Wiradjuri were known to be a generally peaceful people. They had established relationships, albeit often uneasy ones, with some of the local stockmen and settlers in the region prior to the massacre. They would sometimes camp near homesteads, and there were instances of interaction, trade, and even shared labor. They were familiar figures at Henry Danger's Myall Creek station, where the massacre took place. They had sought refuge there, believing it to be a place of relative safety. Their trust, tragically, would be betrayed in the most horrific manner imaginable. On the afternoon of June 10th, 1838, a group of around 12 armed stockmen, led by a squatter named John Fleming, rode up to the huts at Henry Danger's Myall Creek station. They were not seeking justice for a specific crime committed by this particular group of Wiradjuri people. Instead, they were driven by a broader desire for reprisal against Aboriginal people in general, following stock losses and conflicts elsewhere in the district. The Wiradjuri group camped at Myall Creek, numbering around 40 to 50 individuals, were known to be peaceful and had done nothing to provoke such an attack. The stockmen rounded up the terrified Aboriginal people, tying them together with rope. The group, including elderly men, women, and many young children, some mere infants, were bound and helpless. Pleas for mercy were ignored. The perpetrators acted with chilling efficiency and brutality. The bound Wirayarai were then forcibly marched away from the station huts a short distance into the bush towards the slope of a ridge. There, out of sight of the main station buildings, the slaughter began. Immediately after the horrific slaughter, the perpetrators made concerted efforts to conceal their crime. They knew that what they had done was illegal, even by the often lax standards of frontier justice when it came to violence against Aboriginal people. Their first act of concealment was an attempt to dispose of the evidence, the bodies of their victims. Several days after the massacre, some of the perpetrators returned to the site. They gathered the remains of the men, women, and children they had murdered and built a large bonfire. The bodies were piled onto the pyre and set alight, in an attempt to burn them to ashes and obliterate any physical trace of the atrocity. Despite their efforts, whispers of the massacre began to spread. The station manager at Myall Creek, William Hobbs, who was absent during the massacre but returned shortly after, became suspicious. The reports of the massacre eventually reached the ears of the colonial authorities in Sydney, including Governor Sir George Gipps. Gipps was determined that the perpetrators of the Myall Creek atrocity should be brought to justice. He ordered a thorough investigation, dispatching Police Magistrate Edward Denny Day from Muswell Brook to the remote Myall Creek station to gather evidence and apprehend the suspects. This official response was, in itself, a significant departure from the usual indifference shown towards violence against Aboriginal people. Magistrate Day's investigation was painstaking. He interviewed William Hobbs, George Anderson, and others. He meticulously examined the massacre site, collecting bone fragments and other evidence that had survived the attempted cremation. Based on the evidence gathered, 11 of the 12 stockmen involved were arrested and brought to Sydney to stand trial. John Fleming, the leader, managed to evade capture and was never tried. The first trial, held in November 1838, resulted in a shocking acquittal for the 11 accused men. The all-white, all-male jury seemed swayed by the prevailing racist attitudes of the time. However, the Attorney General, John Hubert Plunkett, with Governor Gipps's support, took the highly unusual step of ordering a second trial for 7 of the men. The conviction and execution of 7 white men for the murder of Aboriginal people at Myall Creek sent shockwaves through the colonial society of New South Wales. For many settlers, particularly those on the frontier, the verdict was an outrage. They viewed it not as an act of justice, but as a betrayal by the government in Sydney. A significant portion of the colonial press was vehemently critical of the outcome, arguing that the executed men were martyrs. Public meetings were held to condemn the executions, and there were widespread expressions of sympathy for the hanged men, rather than for their Aboriginal victims. Unfortunately, the Myall Creek convictions did not herald an end to frontier violence. Massacres and violent dispersals of Aboriginal people continued in many parts of Australia for decades to come. For many decades following the trials and executions, the Myall Creek Massacre, like so many other similar events, was largely erased from the dominant narrative of Australian history. The settler society, eager to forge a heroic story of pioneering spirit and nation-building, had little appetite for confronting the darker aspects of its past. The memory of Myall Creek survived primarily within Aboriginal communities, passed down through oral traditions, a painful reminder of loss and injustice. For white Australia, it became part of a great Australian silence, a deliberate forgetting. This collective amnesia was convenient. It allowed for the celebration of colonial achievements without the uncomfortable acknowledgement of the human cost. However, truth has a way of enduring, even when suppressed. Throughout the 20th century, historians and Aboriginal activists began to challenge the silence. They started to uncover and retell the stories of frontier violence, including the Myall Creek Massacre. The process of remembering has been slow and often painful. Forgetting was easier, but it came at the cost of justice and true reconciliation. The modern era has seen a significant shift towards acknowledging and memorializing the Myall Creek Massacre. In 2000, a permanent memorial was dedicated at the site of the massacre. This memorial, a simple yet powerful granite boulder with plaques telling the story, stands as a permanent testament to the victims and a place for reflection and remembrance. Each year, on the Sunday of the June long weekend, a commemorative service is held at the Myall Creek Memorial. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of people gather, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians walking together in a spirit of remembrance and reconciliation. The service includes speeches, music, and a smoking ceremony. It is a deeply moving event, a public acknowledgement of the atrocity that occurred, and a commitment to ensuring it is never forgotten. Memorializing events like Myall Creek is not about assigning guilt to present generations, but about acknowledging historical truths and fostering empathy and understanding. The journey towards reconciliation is long and complex, but sites like Myall Creek serve as important touchstones. They remind us that history, no matter how painful, cannot be ignored if we are to truly understand who we are as a nation.